The richest soul in the galaxy had never received the smallest gift. The winter wind drifted softly through the towering pine trees that surrounded the quiet mountain town, carrying the comforting scent of cedar smoke, fresh bread, and distant fireplaces into the evening sky. Christmas lights had already begun appearing on rooftops even though the holiday was still weeks away, each tiny bulb glowing against the cold blue dusk like little promises that ordinary people somehow managed to keep every year. Daniel Carter parked his aging pickup truck outside Carter's Auto Repair just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the snow-covered hills. At 34 years old, he had long ago accepted that his life would never make headlines. His hands were rough from years of fixing engines. His work boots carried permanent stains of oil and grease. And every evening he hurried home not because someone important was waiting, but because two children believed their father could fix almost anything. Emily, 12, and Noah, 8, never cared how much money Daniel earned. They only cared that he always came home. Daniel smiled as he climbed into the truck, noticing a message from Emily reminding him not to forget hot chocolate on the way home. He laughed quietly to himself. Some emergencies truly could not wait. Above the peaceful Earth, hidden beyond ordinary satellites and invisible to every telescope, another world moved silently through the darkness. A royal diplomatic vessel floated without sound, its polished surface reflecting distant stars like liquid silver. Inside, Princess Seraphine stood alone before an enormous observation window. Countless planets recognized her name. Entire civilizations bowed when she entered a room. Advisors memorized every preference she had ever spoken aloud. Yet silence remained her closest companion. The royal chamber surrounding her was breathtaking. Marble-like crystal columns reached toward a ceiling that shimmered with living constellations. Elegant holographic artwork floated gently through the air. Sophisticated machines quietly maintained perfect temperature, perfect lighting, perfect comfort. Everything was flawless. Everything was empty. An elderly royal attendant approached carefully before lowering her head. "Your Highness, tomorrow's diplomatic schedule has been confirmed." Seraphine nodded without turning around. "Very well. Delegations from 17 systems will be present. As expected, there will also be a ceremonial banquet in your honor." She remained silent for a moment before asking, "Will they enjoy themselves?" The attendant blinked in confusion. "Your Highness, the guests, will they smile?" The woman hesitated before answering honestly. "They will fulfill every tradition perfectly." Seraphine slowly lowered her eyes. That was not the answer she had hoped to hear. She had spent 24 years learning thousands of diplomatic customs, hundreds of languages, and every protocol required of future rulers. She knew how to negotiate peace between rival planets. She knew the history of extinct civilizations. She knew how stars were harvested for energy. Yet somewhere inside her beautiful education there existed an absence she had never learned to name. Later that evening, while reviewing cultural archives about Earth before her first official visit, one insignificant file unexpectedly caught her attention. A short recording showed a little girl laughing as friends surrounded her with colorful decorations. Someone placed a cake in front of her while everyone sang together. The child closed her eyes, smiled with complete trust, and blew out tiny candles. The recording ended after only 23 seconds. Seraphine replayed it once, then again, then a third time. Finally, she turned toward the ship's central intelligence. "Identify this ceremony." The calm synthetic voice answered immediately. "Human birthday celebration." Seraphine tilted her head slightly. "Define birthday." There was a brief pause. "A recurring annual celebration honoring the day an individual was born, typically shared with family and loved ones." Her expression remained composed, yet something almost imperceptible changed behind her golden eyes. "Family celebrates every year?" "Affirmative." She stood completely still. "Does the Imperial Archive contain records of my birthdays?" The computer searched every royal database in less than a second. "No birthday celebrations found." "None." "Negative." Imperial tradition recognizes coronations, achievements, military honors, and diplomatic anniversaries. Birthdays are not recognized ceremonies within the royal house. The vast chamber suddenly felt much larger than before. Seraphine looked back toward the tiny frozen image of the smiling human child. For the first time in her carefully ordered life, the future ruler of one of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy quietly whispered a question that no royal tutor had ever prepared her to ask. "What does it feel like when someone celebrates that you simply exist?" The following morning arrived wrapped in pale winter light that spilled gently across the mountain valley, turning every rooftop and pine branch into silver. Daniel Carter had always believed that mornings revealed more about a family than evenings ever could. Even before the coffee finished brewing, Noah was searching for his missing boot. Emily was humming while flipping pancakes that were slightly too large for the skillet, and the old golden retriever named Murphy patiently waited beneath the table, convinced that gravity would eventually deliver breakfast. It was noisy, imperfect, and wonderfully predictable. Hundreds of miles above Earth, predictability carried a very different meaning. Princess Seraphine's diplomatic vessel slipped silently into orbit as ambassadors prepared for the official reception that would begin later that afternoon. Her attendants moved with flawless precision, adjusting ceremonial robes woven from luminous fabric that shimmered like moonlight on fresh snow. Every movement followed centuries of protocol. Every word had already been rehearsed. When one attendant presented a jeweled ceremonial collar, Seraphine accepted it politely before glancing once more at the human recording she had secretly saved the night before. The little girl was still smiling as invisible voices sang around her. Seraphine paused the recording on that single expression. It fascinated her more than any historical archive ever had. One smile seemed to contain an entire language she had never been taught. As her shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere, she watched clouds drift beneath the windows in slow white rivers. The forest stretched for miles, interrupted by winding roads, frozen lakes, and clusters of homes that looked impossibly small from above. She wondered how such an ordinary world had created a tradition so extraordinary. Meanwhile, Daniel locked the repair shop for the afternoon after receiving an unexpected call from the town council. They needed a volunteer mechanic to inspect several utility vehicles assigned to an international cultural event taking place nearby. It sounded routine enough. Emily teased him about finally wearing a clean jacket, while Noah insisted that anyone meeting visitors from another country deserved homemade cookies. Daniel laughed and promised to bring the empty container home. By early afternoon, temporary security checkpoints surrounded the community center without disrupting the town's relaxed atmosphere. Local volunteers arranged flowers, musicians tuned their instruments, and children practiced welcoming songs for distinguished guests whose names most of them could barely pronounce. Daniel finished tightening the last bolt beneath a transport vehicle when a convoy unlike anything he had ever imagined descended almost silently beyond the tree line. The aircraft reflected the winter sunlight with a polished brilliance that looked less manufactured than sculpted from light itself. No engines roared. No smoke followed. Everything moved with quiet confidence. The door opened, and several elegantly dressed attendants stepped onto the ground before one final figure appeared. Princess Seraphine walked forward with graceful composure, her ivory complexion almost luminous beneath the crisp afternoon sky. Her platinum hair rested neatly across the shoulders of a flowing ceremonial cloak trimmed with intricate silver embroidery that caught every ray of sunlight. She looked neither intimidating nor distant. She simply looked alone. Daniel found himself studying her expression rather than her remarkable appearance. Hundreds of cameras focused on the visiting princess, yet her eyes wandered past the reporters, beyond the officials, and settled on something completely unexpected. A young father nearby had lifted his laughing daughter onto his shoulders so she could wave more easily at the arriving guests. The child's tiny mitten brushed against his cheek as she giggled. The father laughed with her. Seraphine watched that brief moment with quiet curiosity, almost forgetting the welcoming speeches waiting ahead. For reasons she could not explain, the image lingered in her heart far longer than the applause surrounding her arrival. The reception continued beneath a crystal blue winter sky as guests drifted between displays of local crafts, warm food, and carefully prepared cultural exhibits. Daniel Carter had expected speeches, handshakes, and far more waiting than working, but instead he found himself answering questions about engines from curious visitors who had never seen an old gasoline pickup truck before. The conversations were easy, honest, and occasionally funny. Emily and Noah wandered nearby with other children, proudly explaining how maple syrup was collected every spring and insisting that homemade pie tasted better than anything sold in a store. Princess Seraphine moved through the gathering with practiced elegance, accompanied by attendants who quietly guided every step according to centuries of royal etiquette. Every greeting followed protocol. Every smile was measured. Every conversation ended exactly when scheduled. Yet she noticed something unusual among the humans. They interrupted one another without offense. They laughed before sentences were finished. Children tugged gently at their parents' sleeves while adults answered without irritation. Nothing appeared perfectly organized, but somehow everything felt alive. During a brief pause between diplomatic meetings, Seraphine stepped away from the crowd toward a small observation garden behind the community center. Frost covered the wooden benches like delicate glass, and tiny birds hopped across the snow searching for scattered seeds. She welcomed the silence. It reminded her of home, although this silence carried warmth instead of loneliness. Daniel arrived a few moments later carrying 2 steaming paper cups. He hesitated when he recognized the princess standing alone. Protocol suggested he should leave, but simple kindness suggested otherwise. He approached slowly and offered 1 cup with an easy smile. "It is just hot chocolate," he said. No official ceremony attached. Seraphine studied the cup with careful curiosity before accepting it with both hands. Gentle warmth spread through the thin paper into her fingers. She inhaled the rich scent of cocoa and vanilla. "Thank you," she answered softly. "This beverage is comforting." Daniel leaned lightly against the wooden railing overlooking the snow-covered valley. Winter has a way of convincing people to slow down. For several quiet moments, they simply watched the wind stir the pine branches. The silence felt surprisingly comfortable. Finally, Seraphine spoke. "Your children appear happy." Daniel smiled toward the distant sound of Noah laughing. "Most days they are. Some days they are not. That is family." She lowered her eyes thoughtfully. "Your definition is different from ours." Daniel glanced at her with quiet curiosity, but did not press for details. Instead, he asked, "Did you enjoy the welcome today?" Seraphine considered the question longer than expected. "Everyone honored me perfectly." Daniel noticed she had not actually answered. "Was it enjoyable?" he asked gently. She looked at the cup, warming her hands before speaking almost in a whisper. "I do not know the difference." The words lingered between them like visible breath in the cold air. Daniel felt no pity, only quiet surprise. Someone admired across entire star systems had never learned to separate duty from joy. Before either of them could continue, Emily ran toward her father holding a colorful school calendar she had been using for a local history project. "Dad," she called cheerfully, "I finally found the date I needed." She stopped suddenly after realizing she had interrupted royalty and offered an embarrassed apology. Seraphine smiled kindly. "There is no need." Emily opened the calendar anyway, pointing proudly at rows of birthdays marked in bright colors with hand-drawn balloons and little cakes beside. Every family member's name. Seraphine looked at the page with growing fascination. One small square could hold an entire celebration. One ordinary date could belong completely to a single person. She quietly traced the colorful drawings with her eyes before asking the simplest question she had ever spoken. "Do all families remember every birthday?" Daniel answered Emily's question with the kind of smile that appeared only when he spoke about family traditions. "We try to," he said. "Sometimes we forget the exact day because life gets busy, but we never forget the person." The sentence settled gently into the cold afternoon air. Princess Seraphine remained still, her golden eyes resting on the colorful calendar as though it contained the answer to a mystery greater than any she had encountered among the stars. Every square held a name, a small drawing, or a handwritten note. Some birthdays were marked with balloons, others with tiny cakes, and one had a crooked smiling sun that Noah proudly admitted he had drawn himself. There was nothing expensive about the paper, nothing ceremonial, yet it carried a warmth that no royal archive had ever possessed. One of the diplomatic aides approached the princess and quietly reminded her that another formal reception would begin in 10 minutes. Seraphine acknowledged the message with a graceful nod before looking once more at the calendar. "May I ask one more question?" she said softly. Daniel gestured for her to continue. "What happens if someone has no achievement worth celebrating?" Emily answered before her father could speak. "That is exactly why birthdays matter." Seraphine turned toward the young girl with genuine curiosity. Emily shrugged in the wonderfully uncomplicated way that only children could manage. "You do not need to earn your birthday. You already did the hard part by being born." Noah nodded enthusiastically. "And everybody gets cake." Daniel laughed quietly while the princess simply looked at the 2 children, searching their faces for any sign of exaggeration. She found none. They believed every word they had spoken. A celebration did not belong to heroes or rulers. It belonged to ordinary people, simply because they existed. The idea felt almost impossible. As the afternoon faded toward evening, the official program finally came to an end. Guests returned home carrying small souvenirs and warm memories, while the royal delegation prepared to depart for their temporary residence outside town. Before entering her transport, Seraphine paused beside Daniel. "Your children have taught me more today than many scholars." Daniel smiled. "They have a talent for asking simple questions that adults forget." She hesitated, then spoke with unusual uncertainty. "Tomorrow is listed in my biological records as the beginning of another orbital cycle since my birth." Daniel frowned slightly. "You mean tomorrow is your birthday?" She considered the unfamiliar word before answering. "According to your definition, yes." Daniel's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "And no one is planning anything?" Seraphine offered a polite smile that carried no disappointment, because disappointment required expectation. "There are 2 strategic briefings, one economic summit, and an evening state banquet." Daniel understood immediately. Every hour had been scheduled. Every duty had been honored. Yet not one moment belonged to Seraphine herself. She thanked him once more before stepping inside the silent transport, its doors closing with a whisper instead of a sound. Daniel watched the vehicle disappear beyond the snow-covered trees until only the fading light remained. During the drive home, the truck's heater rattled softly while Emily stared out the window. "Dad?" she finally whispered. "She has never had a birthday, has she?" Daniel kept both hands on the steering wheel, remembering the princess's calm expression when she described another year of life as nothing more than an orbital cycle. "No," he answered quietly. Noah leaned forward from the back seat. "Then somebody should fix that." Daniel glanced at his children in the rearview mirror. Neither of them was smiling now. Outside, the first snowflakes of the evening began drifting through the headlights, and somewhere between the repair shop and home, an ordinary family made a silent decision that would soon become far bigger than any of them could imagine. Snow continued falling through the night, covering the town with a quiet blanket that softened every rooftop and every winding road. Inside the Carter house, the kitchen lights remained on long after dinner had ended. Emily spread colored paper across the table, while Noah searched every cabinet for candles that were not already bent from previous celebrations. Daniel stood by the sink with a warm mug of coffee, watching his children work with complete determination. "She has meetings all day," Emily whispered, careful not to wake Murphy sleeping beside the fireplace. "Then we celebrate before the meetings or after them," Daniel replied. "Birthdays are not about perfect timing. They are about making someone feel remembered." Noah held up a small box of mismatched birthday candles. "Do alien princesses like chocolate cake?" Daniel smiled. "Tomorrow we will find out." Before sunrise, the little family visited the only bakery in town that opened early enough for truck drivers and farmers. The owner, Mrs. Alvarez, listened quietly as Daniel explained why he needed a cake on such short notice. She looked toward the snowy street for a long moment before tying on her apron again. "Leave it to me," she said with a gentle smile. "No one should spend a birthday without a cake." By mid-morning, quiet phone calls traveled through the community. The florist donated winter flowers. The music teacher gathered a handful of children willing to learn one simple song. The local librarian found a beautiful blank journal wrapped in blue cloth. The owner of the hardware store contributed tiny white lights usually reserved for holiday windows. Nobody asked who would pay. Nobody asked what they would receive in return. They simply agreed that a celebration belonged to everyone willing to help create it. Meanwhile, Princess Seraphine moved from one formal meeting to another inside the diplomatic residence. Crystal conference tables reflected charts of trade routes and economic projections, while delegates discussed numbers with flawless precision. She answered every question with calm intelligence, yet her thoughts kept drifting back to a colorful paper calendar decorated by children. Between meetings, she quietly opened the cultural archive once again and watched another recording of a human family celebrating a birthday. This time she noticed details she had missed before. The cake was not perfect. One candle leaned sideways. A little boy laughed before the song had finished. Someone clapped off rhythm. None of it seemed organized, yet every face carried unmistakable joy. Her chief advisor entered the room carrying another stack of diplomatic documents. "Your Highness, this evening's banquet begins at 7 o'clock. Seraphine accepted the schedule with her usual grace before asking, "Has anyone in the royal house ever celebrated the day another member was born?" The advisor hesitated. "No, Your Highness. Such recognition has never been considered necessary." She nodded politely, though something inside her quietly questioned why necessity had always mattered more than affection. Late that afternoon, Daniel received unexpected permission from the event coordinator to bring his family to the residence after the official banquet concluded. Only for a few minutes, the coordinator warned. Security will need advance notice. Daniel thanked him sincerely before loading the carefully protected cake into the truck. Emily held the wrapped journal in her lap, while Noah guarded the candles as though they were priceless treasure. None of them knew whether the princess would understand the tradition they were about to share. None of them knew whether royal protocol would allow it. Yet as the truck rolled through softly falling snow beneath strings of glowing holiday lights, every member of the Carter family carried the same quiet hope. Sometimes the smallest celebration could become the biggest memory of someone's life. The evening sky had turned a deep shade of indigo by the time the final diplomatic banquet came to an elegant close. Crystal chandeliers reflected soft golden light across polished floors while ambassadors exchanged formal farewells with carefully measured smiles. Princess Seraphine thanked each delegation with perfect grace, yet her attention drifted again and again toward the windows where gentle snow continued to fall beyond the glass. The endless sequence of speeches, signatures, and ceremonial photographs had ended exactly as scheduled. Everything had been successful. Everything had been flawless. Yet she found herself thinking not about treaties or trade agreements, but about a paper calendar covered with childish drawings and a mechanic who believed every person deserved to be remembered. As the last guest departed, her chief advisor approached with a tablet containing tomorrow's itinerary. Before he could begin reviewing the schedule, a security officer entered quietly and requested permission to admit one local family that had received special clearance from the event coordinator. The advisor frowned slightly, uncertain why anyone would seek an audience at such a late hour. Seraphine looked up with quiet curiosity. Please invite them in. Moments later, Daniel Carter stepped through the entrance carrying a carefully protected cake inside a simple, white bakery box. Emily held a neatly wrapped journal tied with a blue ribbon, while Noah clutched a small package of colorful candles as though they were the most valuable objects in the building. None of them wore expensive clothing. Their boots still carried traces of melting snow, and their cheeks were pink from the cold outside. They looked wonderfully ordinary. Daniel paused a respectful distance away. Your Highness, he said with a warm smile. We hope we are not interrupting anything important. Seraphine answered honestly. You are the most unexpected part of my day. Noah carefully placed the candles on a nearby table and whispered to his sister, loud enough for everyone to hear. Do we tell her now? Emily smiled. I think we should. Daniel nodded gently before looking back at the princess. This morning you told us tomorrow marks another year since you were born. Seraphine inclined her head. Yes. Around here, Daniel continued. That is worth celebrating. Before she could respond, Mrs. Alvarez entered carrying the cake she had baked before sunrise. Behind her came the music teacher with 6 local children, followed by the florist holding a bouquet of winter lilies wrapped in evergreen branches. One by one, familiar faces from the town quietly filled the room. Nobody had been ordered to attend. Nobody represented an official delegation. They had simply come because they wanted to. Seraphine slowly looked around the gathering, recognizing the librarian, the hardware store owner, several volunteers from the community center, and even the elderly groundskeeper who had waved to her earlier that afternoon. She turned toward Daniel with visible confusion. These people know me only from today. Daniel smiled softly. Sometimes one day is enough. Emily stepped forward and offered the blue-wrapped journal. This is for you. You can fill it with every birthday after this one. Seraphine accepted the gift with both hands, her fingers lingering over the ribbon as though she feared the moment might disappear if she moved too quickly. Around her, the room remained wonderfully imperfect. Someone adjusted a crooked decoration. A child accidentally laughed before the music began. The candles were still waiting to be lit. The cake had a little too much frosting on one side, and not a single person seemed concerned that everything was less than perfect. For the first time since arriving on Earth, Princess Seraphine felt something she had never found inside a palace built of crystal or among ceremonies practiced for centuries. She did not feel admired. She did not feel honored. She felt welcomed, and in that quiet difference, an entirely new chapter of her life had already begun before anyone sang the first note. The room grew wonderfully quiet as Noah carefully placed the colorful candles on top of the cake, counting each one twice before stepping back with a satisfied grin. The warm scent of chocolate drifted gently through the hall, mixing with fresh evergreen branches and the faint fragrance of winter lilies. Princess Seraphine stood motionless, her hands still resting on the blue journal Emily had given her only moments before. She had attended coronations beneath crystal domes, witnessed celebrations marking the opening of new star colonies, and watched entire civilizations illuminate their skies in honor of military victories. None of those magnificent ceremonies had prepared her for a gathering where every smile seemed to exist for only one reason: to make another person feel loved. Daniel nodded toward Noah, who reached into his pocket and produced a small lighter with dramatic seriousness. One by one, the tiny flames came alive. Their gentle glow reflected across the polished silver serving tray and danced inside Seraphine's golden eyes. The candles were uneven. One leaned slightly to the left, another burned a little brighter than the rest, and a tiny drop of wax slid slowly down the side before hardening. Somehow those small imperfections made the scene feel more beautiful than flawless symmetry ever could. Emily looked around the room with a bright smile. Ready? The children from the music class exchanged nervous glances before beginning the familiar melody. Their voices were not perfectly synchronized. One singer came in a beat early, another giggled halfway through the first line, yet the song filled the hall with something no orchestra could have rehearsed into existence. Daniel joined quietly, followed by Mrs. Alvarez, the librarian, the florist, the mechanic from the next town, the elderly groundskeeper, and finally every member of the royal staff who found themselves listening from the doorway. Seraphine did not understand every word, but she understood the intention carried inside every voice. The final note faded into a silence so gentle that even the falling snow outside seemed to pause. Daniel smiled warmly. "Happy birthday, Seraphine." No title, no formal greeting, only her name. She looked around the room as though searching for someone else. "This celebration," she whispered. "It is for me." Emily laughed softly. "Of course it is. But I accomplished nothing today." Daniel shook his head. "You do not have to accomplish something to deserve kindness." Noah added with complete confidence. "Today is about you being here." Seraphine lowered her gaze toward the tiny candles. Her voice became almost too quiet to hear. "No one has ever gathered because I was born." The sentence settled over the room with unexpected weight. Several of the royal attendants looked down without speaking. They realized the princess had spoken the simple truth. Throughout her entire life, she had been honored for responsibility, admired for discipline, and respected for duty. Never simply celebrated as a daughter, a young woman, or another living soul sharing the universe. Daniel stepped a little closer without crossing the respectful distance between them. "Then let tonight be the first." Seraphine closed her eyes for a brief moment. "I have seen humans do something before extinguishing the candles." Emily nodded eagerly. "You make a wish. Does the wish always come true?" Noah shrugged with cheerful honesty. "Not always. But hoping together is part of the tradition." A gentle smile finally appeared across Seraphine's face, small at first, then brighter than anyone had expected. It was not the practiced smile she wore during diplomatic receptions. It reached her eyes, softened every careful expression she had learned since childhood, and transformed the room more completely than the candlelight itself. She opened her eyes again, looked at every familiar face surrounding her, drew one quiet breath, and leaned forward toward the waiting flames, carrying inside her heart the very first wish she had ever been free to make for herself. The last candle flickered gently before disappearing into a thin ribbon of white smoke that curled upward through the warm light of the hall. For a heartbeat, nobody spoke. Princess Seraphine remained leaning slightly over the cake, watching the tiny stream of smoke rise higher until it vanished into the ceiling above. She had expected applause or another formal instruction, but instead she heard something much quieter. Emily clapped first. Noah followed a second later with so much enthusiasm that everyone else began laughing. Soon the room filled with cheerful applause that carried no obligation, no ceremony, and no expectation of perfection. It was simply happiness shared without calculation. Mrs. Alvarez carefully sliced the chocolate cake while Noah insisted on giving the princess the largest piece because, as he proudly explained, birthday people always get the biggest one. Seraphine accepted the plate with both hands as though receiving a priceless work of art. She studied the frosting, the uneven layers, and the colorful sprinkles scattered across the top before tasting a small bite. Rich chocolate, warm vanilla, and sweet butter blended together in a way no royal banquet had ever attempted. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, not because the flavor was extraordinary, but because every ingredient carried the unmistakable feeling that someone had made it especially for her. Daniel watched quietly from across the room. He noticed that the princess smiled more often now, not with practiced elegance, but with the relaxed expression of someone who no longer felt the need to guard every emotion. Even her attendants seemed different. One accepted a slice of cake after years of refusing food during official ceremonies. Another found herself laughing when Noah accidentally placed too much whipped cream on his own nose. Formal distance slowly gave way to simple conversation. The evening became wonderfully ordinary. As guests gathered around the fireplace with cups of hot chocolate, Seraphine opened the blue journal Emily had given her. The first page contained only a handwritten sentence surrounded by small stars drawn in colored pencil. You never need a reason to be celebrated. Being you is enough. She traced the words gently with her fingertips. Did you write this? She asked. Emily nodded, suddenly shy. I hoped it would make you smile again next year. Seraphine looked toward Daniel. Your daughter understands something our greatest philosophers overlooked. Before Daniel could answer, the quiet atmosphere shifted as the doors opened once more. Several senior members of the royal delegation entered, accompanied by the imperial chancellor, an elderly statesman known throughout the alliance for his unwavering devotion to tradition. His eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in the half-finished cake, the paper decorations, the glowing candles that had already burned down, and finally the unmistakable smile on the princess's face. No one spoke. The room became still. The chancellor approached Seraphine with measured steps before stopping beside the table. For several long moments he simply observed the gathering. Then his gaze settled upon the birthday cake. Your Highness, he said quietly, may I ask what this ceremony represents? Seraphine looked around the room at Daniel, Emily, Noah, the townspeople, and her own attendants before answering with calm certainty. It is the first tradition that has ever celebrated me before my title. The chancellor lowered his eyes, and those nearest him noticed something unexpected. His expression softened with a quiet sadness, as though he had suddenly remembered something from a childhood too distant to name. When he finally looked back toward the princess, his voice carried none of its usual formality. Then perhaps, he said gently, our civilization has overlooked something far more valuable than we ever realized. Morning sunlight poured through the towering windows of the diplomatic residence, painting long ribbons of gold across the polished floor where only hours earlier a homemade birthday cake had rested beneath a circle of flickering candles. The decorations had already been carefully removed, yet one small detail remained. A single blue ribbon from Emily's gift lay folded beside Princess Seraphine's journal, untouched, as though she could not bear to place it among official belongings. The imperial chancellor stood quietly near the window while senior advisors assembled for what everyone expected to be another routine briefing. Instead, the elderly statesman placed a small recording device on the conference table. The room filled with familiar voices. Children singing imperfectly. Laughter arriving too early. Daniel wishing the princess a happy birthday by her name instead of her title. Silence settled over the chamber as the recording ended. No one spoke for several long moments. Finally, the chancellor looked toward the royal council. Yesterday, he said softly, our future ruler experienced something our civilization has never offered its own children. One advisor protested that traditions existed for stability, not sentiment. Another argued that rulers must remain above ordinary customs. The chancellor listened patiently before asking a single question. If our traditions teach duty but forget joy, are they complete? No one answered. Seraphine stepped forward holding the blue journal against her heart. For 24 years, she said with calm honesty, I believed respect was the highest gift one person could receive. Yesterday, a human family taught me there is something even greater. To be loved without first earning it. Her words traveled across every official communication channel as representatives throughout the alliance listened in complete silence. Then she made her first royal request. I ask that every child born within our worlds be recognized each year, not for achievement, rank, or promise, but simply because their life has value. The request was unprecedented. It required rewriting ceremonies older than entire civilizations. It demanded resources, planning, and the courage to admit that an ancient empire had overlooked something beautifully simple. The council voted before the afternoon ended. For the first time in recorded history, the motion passed without a single opposing voice. Months later, the first imperial day of birth arrived. Across 17 star systems, families gathered inside homes, stations, and distant colonies. Tables filled with homemade food instead of ceremonial banquets. Parents embraced children without waiting for accomplishments. Tiny candles glowed beneath unfamiliar songs translated into dozens of languages. Many celebrations were imperfect. Cakes leaned to one side. Decorations hung unevenly. Children laughed before songs were finished. Nobody considered those flaws worth correcting. They had learned that love did not require perfection. Back on Earth, another winter evening settled gently over the Carter house. Daniel repaired an old snow shovel while Emily wrote in her school notebook, and Noah proudly hung a new ornament shaped like a tiny silver star. A soft knock sounded at the front door. Outside stood a courier from the diplomatic mission carrying a carefully wrapped wooden box. Inside rested a crystal ornament carved in the shape of a birthday candle, glowing faintly from within. Beneath it lay a handwritten note in elegant script. To the Carter family. You gave one princess a birthday. She gave an empire the courage to remember its children. With gratitude always, Seraphine. Daniel placed the ornament on the family mantle beside ordinary holiday decorations. That night, as snow drifted quietly beyond the windows, countless stars shone above two worlds forever connected by one simple human tradition. In homes scattered across the galaxy, children closed their eyes, made wishes before tiny candles, and smiled because a human family had once decided that the birth of a lonely princess was worth celebrating.